You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program, and thank you for joining us today. I'm your host, Daniel Davis, and today joining us on the program is the author of a book, Lost History. And our guest joining us today is Michael Morgan to talk about the lost history of the contribution of the Muslim culture and some of the things that maybe we should discover about history and its true sources. For instance, I remember growing up as a little child in grade school, and Christopher Columbus was the superhero to me. He sailed off into the ocean blue, discovered America, so we were told. We were made to take crayons and on a giant piece of blank paper sketch those particular boats and show just how wonderful it was as he skipped across the ocean to do just that. The hard part about it, though, was years later as I discovered that he actually never really landed on America, as I understand, but it was actually an area called the West Indies, in which he collected pretty much the fruits of all of their labor, as well as their prizes and whatever you want to call it. And here he laid to rest a culture that is completely extinct that we will never know from again. And I thought to myself, is that really what heroes do? So it began to get me questioning about a lot of other things as well, and you're starting to see a resurgence of history revisited. We're really getting the real lowdown, if you will, about the kind of history that we learned about versus the real history as it is. And Michael Morgan is joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today to share with us just that, a lost history. And Michael, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today.
Well, thanks for having me, Daniel. It's great to be here.
Now, tell us what got you interested in the direction of learning about the Muslims and their contributions to the world as we know it today.
Well, it kind of built on me slowly. It wasn't really my area of specialization. And when I was a U.S. diplomat, I focused more on Latin America and Europe. But my second language is Spanish, and I studied Spanish language and literature and history, and always in the background was that thing called the Moorish period. When I was going to school, it was really a footnote, although it was a 781-year footnote because the what we call the Moors, the Arabs, were present in Spain from 711 of the current era until 1492. You mentioned Christopher Columbus, and that year 1492 has another very powerful meaning for people, frankly, for Spanish Jews and Arabs who were either forced to leave Spain at that point or convert to Catholicism. But this thing built on me. I did some work in Turkey. When I was a diplomat, I was in Israel and Egypt. I did some work in Indonesia. And then after 9/11, I started reading and realized that our sense of history here in the West is, while it's not, I wouldn't say that it's incorrect, it leaves out a lot of other stuff, and I fear that if we don't know the fullness of who we are and where we come from, then we may be floundering around in the present and the future.
It certainly makes a lot of sense. Now, as I was looking over a speech that you gave on lost history, which was to Georgetown, as I understand it?
Yeah, I've been doing a lot of talks for the last year, but that was one place I went, yeah.
Is that I'm taking a look at this, and I'm astounded at the core root of how, as we understand particular things, for instance, the flight of the Wright brothers, these were the first people to get into the air, but really it goes a lot further back than that. You take a look at algebra, algorithms, which everybody, as they understand them, is used in software today, and it just goes on and on and on, and you look at how it's sort of tributaried off of these roots into areas that actually took credit for some of these things. So why do you think that happened?
Well, I think part of it is that what we're talking about is a long time ago. The peak of Islamic culture came somewhere between the 9th century and, say, the 14th century. So it's a long time ago, and Americans tend not to look back that far. I mean, we're interested in World War II and Civil War, and maybe we look back at European history, but this really precedes modern European history. Up until about 1600, Europeans were very aware of how much they had received from the Islamic world, especially in mathematics, medicine, literature. I mean, the 1001 Nights was really the seed of a lot of the stuff like the Canterbury Tales and the Decameron by Boccaccio had a lot of roots in Arabian stuff. But I think part of it is, as I say, because it was a long time ago, and then when Europe really starts to take off around, let's say 1600, there's a tendency to start to rewrite history as though Europe invented everything, and Europe. The developments that come in Europe are phenomenal. They're unprecedented in human history. The explosion of knowledge, but what gets forgotten as history is rewritten after 1600 is where a lot of the seeds of that came from, and a lot of them came from further south and east. I mean, now I think part of it is, you could say that the writing of history is political. The version of our history that I was given was that when you look way back into the past, what we call the West has its roots in Greece and Rome, then comes through the European Renaissance and the Enlightenment, and then the colonization of America and the founding fathers and all that. But there's no mention at all of the Islamic sources of a lot of what we got. And when you start digging, when you go to the library and start reading, you see that it's really a huge omission, because a major part of our ideas of science and math and medicine and philosophy and social organization come from places like Cairo and Damascus and Cordoba in Spain and so on, and it's really an eye-opener.
I think what's interesting, the point that you just make, is about this omission. It was just occurring to me when you think of civilization, if you go back 5,000 or 10,000 years, around the time that Egypt was actually beginning to grow and flourish, and you take a look at the mathematics that was involved in the awesome engineering of building, for instance, the pyramids. Right. But then it seems like history jumps, and all of a sudden now we're at BC, and then pretty soon we're at the year zero, which is apparently when Christ was born. Then it begins to jump forward to 1500, and then all of a sudden you start seeing, as you're saying, this is when all this stuff started to happen. It was like in the next 1500 years, and I'm thinking, what about all that time before all that, and where were all these people then? Where all of a sudden, as you're saying, that you were saying here, is that here Europe's taking the credit, Greece, maybe Italy, and the like, and they're taking the credit for all these things. But like you said, there's this huge gap, and how did that happen?
Well, there really is. I mean, I think part of it is everybody likes to think that their culture is the best. I think it's just a natural human thing. It's like supporting your hometown football team or whatever. But it's not quite that simple, and it's really hard when you start to get into reading about history. You see that the standard version that you get, which is that there's this long dark thing called the Dark Ages in Europe. It really wasn't quite that dark, and there was a lot of stuff going on, not so much in Europe, but in the Middle East and in Central Asia and Persia, and then down into India and China. There's a lot of stuff. There's stuff going on in Central America 1,000 years ago. The Mayas, we consider a primitive culture, but when you look at some of the concepts that they developed, especially in mathematics and astronomy, you can't call them a primitive culture. What they were was an isolated culture, and then one that for whatever reason declined and basically disappeared. But there was stuff going on. It's just our memory banks don't seem to go back far enough, and we tend to we don't pay much attention to the detail of the stuff that was going on.
Now, why do you think the Muslim culture, you take a look at Muslim and Islam, and the first thing everybody starts thinking about is religious holy wars. These people are nuts. You take a look at the war in the Middle East, which we all pretty much know is a fallacy in and of itself, but the whole idea that in many cases they seem to be betrayed as these crazy people that are blowing each other up and this and that and the other. But when you think about the power of invention or the power of creating a specific kind of knowledge, as I was saying earlier in the show, you talk about algorithms for software, you talk about algebra or flight. you're in an advanced mode of thinking that war and violence are so primitive that they're not even really part of the culture when you're to that level of creativity. So why were they sort of iced out, if you will? Or as you said in your speech, the refrigerator effect.
Yeah. Well, there's a part of it is that any system needs to be renewed. Any country, any organization, any corporation, any family, if you don't renew it over time, it tends to, go through an organic cycle of growth and reaching a peak and then decline and sometimes disappearance. And what happened, I think, with, the best of Islamic culture was that it wasn't renewed, partly for internal reasons, and then partly a lot of external things going on. They had a horrendous invasion, a series of invasions that came from Mongolia and started by Genghis Khan and then his sons and grandsons, that destroyed some of their major centers like Baghdad, which now is kind of a tragic place, but 1,000 years ago Baghdad was the most advanced city in the world.
Wow.
But after the Mongols took care of it, it was gone. And in Europe and the West, I don't think have ever suffered that kind of destruction. The Holocaust, I would say, probably comes close, but just the utter desolation of places by the Mongols. That was the way they used real shock and awe. So part of it was external, and then after 1600, the Europe and the West just take off in such a spectacular way that none of the other older cultures like China, India, the Muslim world can catch up. But at their peak, which was a long time, say from 750 until 1500, the Islamic countries were leading in scientific research and intellectual inquiry and invention and so on. And then because it wasn't renewed, because the economic the economic support system wasn't there anymore to pay for the research and the scholars, and it starts to come apart. Mm-hmm. Some scholars say that the religion changed over time. I would question that. There have always been fringes of, a violent streak there, just like there has been in the West. But whether you can attribute it to the religion itself or just the way certain individuals interpret it, I'm not certain about that.
One of the most interesting things when you take a look at the Islam or Muslim religion is the fact that it seems to me anyway, and I could be wrong, but their battles always seem to be right there within themselves. They don't really take them anywhere else. People might argue, well, what about that 9/11 thing? But who knows about that? But the point is that when you take a look at a Western religion, such as Catholicism or Christianity, I mean, these people literally left their lands and went and conquered and basically, were wiping out civilization, saying this is the way you need to believe. But it seemed that the Muslims kind of stayed to themselves, that if there was any warring going on, it was between them. To me, that would also seem like a high level of thinking as well. Like, these are our problems, and we're not going to concern anybody else, whereas these others were going along and literally assimilating and making others change and actually lose their culture. For instance, the Native Americans, they were forced to speak English tongue. They were no longer allowed to speak their own language. So when you take a look at that, you could see there's tremendous advancement in a particular group, such as the Muslims, of huge thinking.
Well, you have to remember, I don't know if it's quite as clear-cut as that, the early Arabs went on their own imperialist campaign. It's so long ago that nobody remembers it, but in the 8th century, Arab armies made it all the way into central France. It was kind of an accidental campaign, but they finally met their match with a guy named Charles Martel, who really is the godfather of modern Europe. Charles the Hammer, he's the grandfather of Charlemagne. He defeated them in an important battle at Tours in France, and they retreated from that and went back home to Spain and Baghdad and wherever, and sort of refocused themselves on intellectual inquiry. But then there was a second group, the Turks, who went on a major campaign of military conquest up into Central and Eastern Europe, all the way across North Africa. So there were some conquerors and imperialists amongst the Muslims, but they also had periods when they were more focused on their own stuff and not trying to expand it out as the European colonialists did.
For those of you just
the European, the way the Europeans did it, crossing oceans, probably gave a real boost to European culture because it required the development of whole new ways of thinking and administration to have colonies across the ocean. The Turks had a huge empire, but it wasn't a transoceanic one, and I think maybe there's something in that process that stimulated whole new ways of thinking that the Muslims did not acquire.
Interesting stuff. For those of you just joining us, you're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program, and our guest today, Michael Morgan, talking about lost Muslim history. Now, let's talk about some of the key players within the Muslim community that had contributions that generally seem to be attributed to somebody else, because I've seen some interesting ones here that people say, are you really sure about that? Like, for instance, Omar Khayyam, is that how you pronounce it? Okay.
Yeah.
He was a poet, as you say here in your speech, but in 1079, without computers and telescopes, he calculated the length of a year to within .001. That's a thousandth of a second, as I understand it. That's one. But go ahead and talk about some of the other key players within this Muslim community that had what we would call root contributions that are seemingly attributed to other people.
Well, you mentioned earlier algebra and algorithms. People who know languages would recognize that those are words that come from Arabic with the AL in front. That's the article, like in Spanish, EL. But both of those higher mathematical forms we can trace back to a brilliant Persian mathematician who worked in Baghdad 1,200 years ago. His name was Muhammad al-Khwarizmi. That's a tough name. Americans have probably never, ever heard it. But the word algorithm is a derivative of his name, al-Khwarizmi. And what he did was he found a lot of mathematical discoveries that were even older coming from India, like the zero and negative numbers and the decimal system. And then he blended that in with some of his own discoveries in algebra and then the algorithm itself. And that really lays the foundation for today's computation. Software, as you mentioned, Google searches are built on algorithms. A lot of financial market modeling programs. It's really the language of computation, and we tend to think it comes from Silicon Valley and MIT and all that, and the foundation of it comes from Baghdad.
I just had a funny thought that Dewey went in and he stole the test and claimed the decimal system for himself.
Well, that was his library system, but back at 1,200 years ago, the mathematicians really had in Arabia and Europe and so on were floundering around with different ways of doing numbers. The Romans, of course, had the Roman numerals, but try and do a serious mathematical problem with Roman numerals.
Yeah, forget it. Just writing the number 19 can be daunting.
And the Greeks, they had some very high-level geometry and so on, and they'd even started to do some sorts of algebraic things, but they were using Greek letters like pi and all that. But when Mr. Al-Khwarizmi saw this Indian method of writing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 0, he adopted that, and that's really the foundation of everything we have today. Because if we didn't have the Arabic numeral system, I don't know where we'd be, but we wouldn't be where we are.
Now let's talk about some of the other players, like I mentioned earlier when we were talking about the Wright brothers, and there was an interesting little story right there.
Yeah, we in the West we tend to say that Leonardo da Vinci designed the first serious flying machine, and the Wright brothers, had a gasoline-powered propeller engine there to make it fly. But that was around 1903, I think, when the Wright brothers flew, and Leonardo was in the 16th century. But in fact, in Spain, almost 800 years before that, there was this very smart Arab Spanish. He was originally a musicologist and a chemist, but he watched a guy jump off the tower of a mosque in Cordoba, Spain, and survived. The guy had something kind of like an old primitive parachute, and so he said he was going to work on aerodynamics and see if there's a way to make a man fly like a bird. And he spent 25 years, but he built a probably much like a hang glider of wood and cloth and wire and so on, and jumped off a ridge outside Cordoba, Spain. That was in the year 875. Mm-hmm. That's 1,125 years ago or whatever. And this guy was airborne for up to 10 minutes, and he survived it. But he had a terrible crash landing and really hurt himself badly. But that kind of breakthrough, it shows that people have been smart forever, and they've been trying daring things. We tend to think, though, that until the modern era, people were just primitive and not doing that kind of stuff. And in fact, people have been trying far out things for much longer than we realize. Mm-hmm. Another in the area of medicine, one guy that really captured my imagination was an Iranian working about 1,000 years ago, named Ibn Sina. In the West, we know him as Avicenna, and he really is the father of modern psychotherapy. Long before Sigmund Freud, Western medicine, you don't see psychotherapy show up until I guess I don't remember when Freud was, early in the 20th century. Mm-hmm. But this guy was doing a form of talk cure about 900 years before that. And he did other things too. He used poppies for inhalation and anesthesia. We think he may have been the first to ever do that. And they were doing some very modernistic surgeries when Europe had nothing like that. Europe was so backward 900 years ago. If you got sick, you were, it was up to God whether you're going to live or not. But in the Muslim world, they could actually do things that would give you a greater chance of living. There wasn't much of that in Europe at that point.
It's just really fascinating. Now, when you went to, I guess, do your research about these people and about these events, you had said that you didn't really follow the scholarly tradition, in other words, trying to go to historians, but you actually really tried to get to the roots of the real deal. How did you go about finding the information that you found on these particular stories?
When I started out, I was concerned that I would not ever be able to find the documents and materials that I needed, but in fact, a lot of these original texts that were written 1,200, 1,300 years ago have been preserved and translated into English, and they're scattered throughout the great libraries of the U.S. and Europe and everywhere else, like UCLA and Library of Congress. And I was amazed how much of the original stuff was there. So rather than go to modern historians to interpret things, I thought let's just go back to the original and see what they were saying and doing. And I was amazed at how much there was. I'm sorry it's so scattered around, because that's what I was trying to do, was pull it together. For the mainstream reader, I'm not an academic writer. I'm not writing for a university audience. This was for, average readers who don't have time to go digging deep into esoteric stuff like this.
Well, I think, too, when you consider the task that you've taken on, it reminds me of a guest that I had some years ago who wrote a book called Faster Than the Speed of Light, in which he was sort of one-upping Einstein, actually taking things to the next level. What's interesting about his story, this was a 35-year-old Brazilian, of all things. Young man, not stuck in the academic world, but what was most telling about his book was that one of the biggest problems for advance and change comes in the scholarly world, where people are afraid to take risks because of the fact that they would endanger their reputations. And so I started thinking, just based on that premise, you can see how history can be misinterpreted or lost altogether just because of the scholarly bureaucracy, for lack of a better word, that gets you the right information. And that brings me to the point of one Mr. Al Kindi. He was quite an interesting one that kind of fits in with what we're talking about.
Well, I consider him the father of modern empirical scientific method. That empirical method is where you have a thesis, but then you test it against real results, experimentation. And if the thesis doesn't hold up, then you throw it away. Until about 1,200 years ago, the Greeks had kind of dabbled around at that, but they hadn't really institutionalized it. They came up with some really far out theories that were later disproven. For example, I'm trying to remember, but I believe it was Ptolemy said that light was a ray that comes out of your eyeball and projects out onto whatever it is you're looking at.
That's a far-out theory, definitely.
Well, it's far out, and if he'd really worked on it mathematically, he would have come to the conclusion that that wasn't correct, and that's what happened in Cairo 1,000 years later with a mathematician named Ibn al-Haytham. He proved that light was a ray that comes from a source and bounces off an object and enters your eye. But Al-Kindi was the first great Arab Muslim philosopher, and he made some radical statements. He said, we should be open to all ideas, no matter what religion or nationality or race or wherever they come from, because, no single group owns wisdom or knowledge. And it was kind of a radical statement for such a long time ago. He was the father of modern experimentation.
I think Al Kindi and Gene Roddenberry would have been great friends.
Oh, yeah.
And now, in your book, Lost History, first of all, how can people find out how to get a hold of it? And tell us about the book. I mean, obviously, we've touched on some things, but what can they expect when they read this book, Lost History?
Well, it's kind of written, it's not a conventional history with footnotes, facts, dates, and so on.
Right. It's more of a did you know this kind of a thing?
Pardon?
I was saying it's sort of a did you know this sort of a book?
Right. It's what it is almost a novelistic technique that connects the present day to things going on 1,300 years ago to show that this isn't a parlor game, that it's relevant to what we're going through today. And it's written in a dramatic style, like a lot of these events are narrated in a dramatic way, not a dry academic way, because I wanted it to be interesting to people who aren't academics. But it focuses on it opens up with a quick overview of how the culture is founded, and I consider the founder to be Muhammad, since he's the founder of Islam, and this culture comes from that. Just a quick refresher on that, and showing how some of his statements in the Quran and elsewhere were very much about education and knowledge and learning. And then we go into mathematics, which I consider, if you have to pick one piece that's the most important, I would pick math, and then astronomy. Then we get into the sciences like physics and chemistry and metallurgy. Then we go into medicine, which is really as important as the mathematics, because so much of our modern medicine comes from that world, and we don't really remember that. And then into things like literature and music and architecture. And then I talk about something called, it's like civic leadership. A lot of our ideals of what a good leader is come from there, because we didn't really have it in the West until the Renaissance. And a lot of the idea of a Renaissance man, somebody who's good at math and science and literature and poetry and politics and so on, that really comes from the Muslim world. That comes from Baghdad and Damascus and so on.
Now, I'm just wondering, what makes a book like this important for people who want to read it?
I think it's important because as Americans, we're involved in two shooting wars in Muslim countries, and we're also in something called, that the president calls the war on terrorism, and it has really thrust us into a part of the world that we don't have much experience with. The Europeans are much closer to it, and they've been interacting with the Islamic world for 1,200 years. Americans don't have that, and we seem to be lost when it comes to understanding this culture and what it means and what does all this stuff signify. And I'm trying to show that what you're seeing on the TV news is really a tiny slice and the final act of about a 42-act play, and so it's quite confusing. And I think that also what I want to do is show that we, aside from the bad things that we're seeing on the news, we get a lot of good things from that world, and so just to give a broader and deeper understanding. And I think that's really the critical takeaway from this book.
I know just after 9/11, it wasn't too long after that it seemed that Americans were just starving for anything that could get them to understand the Muslim world. And to me, that was a tremendous act of compassion that was contradictory to what our government made us believe we thought about what had happened. And you can definitely see the division now. I mean, we're like, get out of there, leave these people alone. Let's just for now mind our own business and see how we can work all this out. And yet defiantly, we're still moving in that direction, even though as Americans in America, we don't want that we truly have opened that compassion to try to say, who are these people? What do I really need to know about them? And it isn't so fear-based, I think it is. I think it really comes from the fact that we understand that they're just like us. They have the need to be respected, loved, and to be heard. And certainly a book such as yours can let you see these guys aren't just a bunch of maniacs that live in the middle of nowhere, that aren't doing anything or evolved and it's all about religion, that it's probably a lot deeper than that.
Well, it's just that we don't get much information about, about the good things or the neutral things that are happening there. It's all about the conflicts that are going on. And you can't ignore it. I mean, they're there, but in a way, we've elevated the fringe up to represent the whole thing. Our media, every time the Al-Qaeda puts out a video, it's rushed right onto the news and so on. And I got to tell you, I've traveled over there a lot, and that stuff doesn't get nearly as much play. They don't elevate it to that level of attention, and so I think the whole presentation right now is it's way overweighted towards scary stuff, and there's nothing else really being communicated. We're going to have to find a way to coexist with this huge culture, because there are as many as 1.6 billion Muslims in the world. They're ranging from the most liberal, free-thinking people to the most fundamentalists and everything in between, just like Christianity and the others. And I really don't think that the broader issues are going to be solved by military force. That's I think only useful in stopping a terror attack at a particular moment, but it doesn't get at the broader issues, culture, relationships, and so on.
Well, in your experience, Michael, tell me, as you went to research and to bring these facts and these things out, what has been, if any, a transformation on how you view the Muslim or the Islam world?
Well, it was a real eye-opener for me, because I had the same sort of stereotypical view that most Americans and non-Muslims have. And as I got into this, I realized that what we're talking about is it's really the predecessor civilization to our own. They gave us so much. And the other thing that got me was that they were going through a lot of the same arguments and questions 1,000 years ago that we're going through today in America. For example, there was a big debate 1,200 years ago about whether you use rationalism and the mind to unlock the secrets of the universe, or if you go back to holy texts to tell you how the world was formed and so on. This was going on 1,200 years ago, and as I was reading about it, I thought, well, geez, this sounds like the debate in America about creationism, intelligent design, and Darwinism. It's really close, and it's almost heartbreaking to see that all those battles that were going on then have been forgotten, and nobody appreciates how advanced that culture was at one point.
This I'm interested. I mean, after reading your speech and the outlines of it, I was like, this is really intriguing things to know. Just as when you begin to rediscover, and you're seeing that a lot, especially maybe you watch PBS, they're bringing back history, but now all of a sudden you're seeing things that you weren't taught before and thought, well, now that explains why things are the way they are now, much better than the old way was, and why you can see even a book like this is important.
Well, all these problems, Israel and Palestine, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, you really can't understand them if you just look back 10 years or 15 years or 2 weeks. You've really got to look way back, because these are old societies. They've been around a lot longer than we have, and you just can't understand what you're seeing by going back a week. There's all sorts of stuff going on, and we find ourselves in the middle of it, and we're just not equipped to deal with it, I don't think.
Well, it's certainly been a pleasure to have you on our program today. And again, how can people get a hold of your book? And is there a website perhaps they can go to find out more about you and the work that you're doing?
Well, the website for the book is www.losthistoryonline.com. That's Lost History Online, all one word. And then, of course, you can find the book in most major bookstores, Borders and Barnes and Noble and so on. It's also on Amazon and all the online booksellers. And at nationalgeographic.com also you can access it that way. So there are plenty of books around. The paperback is just coming out as we speak. The hardcover came out last June, and there's no shortage of books to buy.
Well, just as anybody who's ever read The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People seek to understand and then be understood, and this is certainly a road that can get somebody in that direction. And we want to thank you for being on our program today.
Well, thanks for having me.
You bet. Again, our guest today joining us is Michael Morgan in his book, Lost History, letting you know that the Muslims had greater contributions that we just didn't even really know about, and that it's important to know those areas of history, because it's sort of like saying to understand that is to understand that who you are is not necessarily entirely your fault, but you were at least part of the process. I'm Daniel Davis. I want to also thank all of you listeners out there for joining us today, and we do welcome your questions or comments here on the Beyond 50 radio program. Just simply shoot me an email, daniel@beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. And also visit our website, beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50, beyond50radio.com. And please subscribe to our free weekly e-newsletter where you can find out about our past shows, our upcoming shows, events, whatever it is that you want to find out about. Beyond 50 is here. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us today. And remember, live your day past halfway.